Picture this. A war so terrifying it wasn't fought on battlefields, but in the minds of every American citizen. Families eating dinner under the constant shadow of nuclear annihilation. Children practicing duck and cover drills in schools, as if a desk could save them from an atomic blast. Now here's the real kicker. The U.S. government told millions of Americans to build shelters in their own backyards. Basements transformed into fortresses. Homes converted into bunkers. And let me hit you with a number that's going to stick in your brain. By 1963, more than 18,000 fallout shelters had been designated in New York City alone. That's not a typo. That's an entire city preparing for the apocalypse. Imagine walking down the streets of Manhattan in 1962 and seeing those black and yellow signs on practically every building. Schools, churches, post offices, hotels. Each one marked with the trefoil symbol that meant one thing. When the bombs drop, run here. It almost sounds like science fiction, but it was completely real. Here's the shocker. These shelters weren't just a military precaution. They were a quiet revolution in how America thought about survival. Think about it. World War II was fought with tanks and soldiers. But the Cold War, it was fought with fear, preparation, and the ability to convince millions of citizens they could survive the unthinkable. The Soviets had their missiles. The Americans had their shelters. That was the kind of edge that doesn't make it into Hollywood movies, but it defined an entire generation. And if you're thinking, okay, but a shelter is just a shelter, here's why you'll want to stick around. These shelters didn't disappear when the Cold War ended. Some are still there, hidden in forgotten basements, marked with rusty signs that still hang on old buildings. They're silent, stubborn reminders of a time when America was preparing for the end of the world on a scale the planet had never seen before. So, in this video, we're going to dive into how these nuclear shelters were born, how they spread across the country like wildfire, what it was really like to live prepared for the apocalypse, and how something designed to protect against the end of the world became a permanent stamp on American history. It's a story about fear, survival, and sheer American ingenuity. And trust me, you'll never look at a basement the same way again. Act 1. The crisis that started it all. By late 1949, America was staring down an existential nightmare. On September 23rd, President Harry Truman made a brief but devastating announcement. The Soviet Union had detonated its first atomic bomb. America's nuclear monopoly was over. Suddenly, the threat of nuclear war wasn't science fiction. It was a real and terrifying possibility. But the real panic didn't hit immediately. Throughout the 1950s, most Americans went about their lives, trusting that the government had everything under control. That illusion shattered in 1961. Two simultaneous crises changed everything. First, the Berlin confrontation, where the U.S. and USSR came to the brink of war over control of the divided city. Second, the Soviet space race demonstrated they had the technology to launch intercontinental nuclear missiles directly at American cities. This urgency wasn't just about protecting military installations. It was about the survival of the civilian population. An American city under nuclear attack wasn't just a military tragedy. It was potentially the collapse of society itself. American planners knew they had to solve the civil defense problem before it was too late. The question wasn't if they'd find a solution. It was how fast they could implement it. And this is where President John F. Kennedy stepped in. In May 1961, Nelson Rockefeller, then governor of New York and chairman of the Governor's Conference Committee on Civil Defense, met with Kennedy to advocate for a national fallout shelter program. 2 weeks later, on July 25, 1961, Kennedy addressed the nation in a televised speech that would change the course of American civil defense. Kennedy was blunt. He spoke of the apathy, indifference, and skepticism surrounding civil defense policy. He asked Congress for over $200 million, equivalent to more than $1.7 billion today, to dramatically strengthen civil defense programs. The message was clear. Every American citizen needed to be prepared for the unthinkable. The timing couldn't have been sharper. With the nation mobilizing in the face of the most serious nuclear threat since Hiroshima, the race was on to build not just weapons and defense systems, but a complete network of shelters to protect millions of civilians. What looked like a simple government response was actually the answer to one of the biggest logistical challenges America had faced in peacetime. It wasn't glamorous. It wasn't something people wanted to talk about at dinner parties. But without these shelters, millions of Americans would be completely exposed, vulnerable not just to enemy fire, but to radiation that could poison entire cities for decades. This wasn't just about architecture or civil engineering. It was about survival. And America was about to prove that solving problems like these, fast and at scale, was one of its greatest strengths. Act 2. The Design and Strategy. When Kennedy launched the call in 1961 for a national fallout shelter program, the job landed in the hands of architects, engineers, and civil defense officials across the country. The task was straightforward on paper, but monumental in practice. Identify or create spaces that could protect millions of Americans from nuclear radiation. It had to be economical, quick to implement, and accessible to the general population. The strategy they developed was brilliantly practical. Instead of building millions of new bunkers from scratch, the government decided to leverage what already existed. They launched the National Fallout Shelter Survey and Marking Program. Teams of architects and engineers, contracted by state and local civil defense offices, surveyed thousands of existing buildings, both public and private, to determine which had spaces that met radiation protection requirements. What were they looking for? Structures with robust basements below ground level, thick walls of brick or concrete, and enough space to house dozens or hundreds of people. Buildings that qualified were marked with location and capacity signs. Those iconic black and yellow signs with the trefoil symbol, designed by Robert W. Blakely, director of the Administrative Logistics Support Function of the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers in 1961, became part of the American urban landscape. The first designated buildings weren't anything fancy. Public schools, post offices, downtown hotels, churches, apartment building basements. By the end of 1964, approximately 1,500 postal buildings had been designated as fallout shelters. In Boston, by the mid-1960s, over 2,000 buildings in the city had been identified, and more than 1,000 of them were marked with official signs. But the strategy didn't stop with community shelters. Kennedy also actively encouraged Americans to build private shelters in their own homes. The response was immediate. The estimated number of private shelters skyrocketed from 60,000 in June 1961 to approximately 200,000 by 1965. Magazines published detailed blueprints. Companies sold prefabricated kits. Hardware stores stocked emergency supplies. The design of a typical home shelter was simple but effective. Most were built in the basement, buried underground for maximum protection. Walls were reinforced with concrete or sandbags. Sealed doors were installed. The interior was equipped with cots, flashlights, battery radios, basic medical supplies, and most critically, food and water supplies to last at least 2 weeks. Survival supplies became their own industry. The government stockpiled millions of cans of survival crackers, containers of drinking water, medical kits, and radiation detection equipment in designated community shelters. Each shelter had signs with instructions on what to do in case of a nuclear attack. Seal entrances, ration supplies, monitor radiation levels with Geiger counters. The flexibility of the system was impressive. Community shelters could be adapted according to local needs. A school basement in New York was configured differently than a post office basement in Kansas. What mattered was the ability to protect people from fallout during the critical days after an attack. But here's the hard part. Not all shelters were equal. A shelter in the center of a city that took a direct hit probably wouldn't have saved anyone. These shelters were specifically designed to protect against fallout, the radioactive particles that fall from the sky after a detonation. The idea was simple. Keep people underground, behind thick walls, until radiation levels decreased enough for it to be safe to emerge. It's easy to look back now and see the fallout shelter program as inevitable, but it really wasn't. It was born out of a specific moment of urgency, a marriage between existential fear and American pragmatism. Without that presidential order, without those engineers working tirelessly, without the participation of millions of citizens, the Cold War might have looked very different. The beauty of the system was its brutal simplicity. concrete, steel, supplies, and a promise. No matter where you lived in America, there would be a place where you could try to survive the unthinkable. Act 3. Mass production and distribution. Once the program was approved in 1961, the United States didn't just designate fallout shelters. They created them, equipped them, and distributed them in numbers that defied belief. America's industrial muscle was already producing aircraft carriers, fighter jets, and missile systems. Adding a massive civil defense program to the list seemed small in comparison, but it became one of the most impressive logistical efforts of the Cold War. How did they do it? The secret was the same formula that drove American wartime industry: mass production and standardization. Congress approved over $169 million, a figure equivalent to more than $1.7 billion today, specifically for structures in which American citizens could shelter from nuclear fallout. Factories across the country were retooled to produce emergency supplies at industrial scale. Millions of cans of survival crackers were stamped out, designed to last years without refrigeration. Hermetically sealed water drums were manufactured. Standardized medical kits were produced. Geiger counters were assembled by the thousands. All of this was packaged, labeled, and shipped to designated shelters in every state. Numbers tell the story best. By 1963, New York City alone had approximately 18,000 designated shelters, with Defense Department plans to add another 34,000 shelters throughout the city. In Boston, over 1,000 buildings were officially marked. Nationwide, tens of thousands of buildings received the black and yellow signs that promised protection. But the real logistical miracle was how all this was coordinated. Each state had its own civil defense office, working with local governments. Inspectors were hired to evaluate buildings. Emergency response teams were trained. Millions of pamphlets explaining what to do in case of nuclear attack were printed and distributed in schools, post offices, and community centers. The pace was relentless. In 1962 and 1963, at the height of the Cuban Missile Crisis, the program went into overdrive. Americans were living under the most real nuclear threat they'd ever experienced. Stores ran out of emergency supplies. Companies selling prefabricated home shelters had months-long backlogs. Fear had turned into action. It's worth comparing this to other countries. While the United States focused on community and private shelters, the Soviet Union built massive underground bunkers for government officials and military personnel. The British had their own shelter program, but no Western nation attempted to protect its civilian population on the scale that the United States did. It was a uniquely American approach, democratic, decentralized, and based on citizen participation. By 1965, although the program began to lose momentum as tensions calmed slightly, the infrastructure was already in place. Thousands of marked buildings, millions of stored supplies, a population that had been trained, at least in theory, on what to do when the siren sounded. It wasn't glamorous, but it meant that in any major American city, there was a network of shelters waiting. They weren't luxury bunkers. They were basements, mostly. But in the context of nuclear war, a basement with thick walls and provisions could mean the difference between life and death. In the end, the production figures rivaled some of the biggest hardware programs of the conflict. Fallout shelters weren't just civil defense infrastructure. They were a symbol of America's ability to mobilize resources, organize at massive scale, and prepare for the worst. It was one thing to send soldiers overseas. It was something entirely different to prepare an entire civilian population to survive nuclear apocalypse, right in their own backyards. Act 4. Living under the nuclear threat. Living in America during the 1960s under the constant threat of nuclear annihilation was unlike anything most Americans had ever experienced. For many, especially children, it became part of everyday life. Schools conducted regular duck and cover drills. Air raid sirens were tested monthly, and those black and yellow fallout shelter signs were everywhere, constant reminders that the world could end at any moment. The designated community shelters weren't secret military bunkers. They were places people went every day. Your school's basement, the downtown post office, the neighborhood church. Suddenly, these mundane spaces had a terrifying dual purpose. During the day, They functioned normally. But if the siren sounded, these same places were supposed to save your life. The interiors of community shelters varied widely. Some were simple concrete spaces, barely modified beyond storing emergency supplies in corners. Others were more elaborate, with improved ventilation systems, reinforced doors, and clear signage about capacity and procedures. Most had the basics: water drums, boxes of survival crackers, first aid kits, emergency radios, and critically, Geiger counters to monitor radiation levels. But here's the hard truth. These shelters weren't places where you'd want to spend time. They were dark, often damp and crowded. Capacity estimates were optimistic at best. A basement marked for 300 people would probably be uncomfortable with 200. There was no privacy, little ventilation, and the atmosphere would be claustrophobic. But compared to the alternative, direct exposure to deadly radioactive fallout, they were a godsend. For families who built private shelters, the experience was different. These home shelters became strange family projects. Fathers spent weekends digging and pouring concrete in their backyards or reinforcing basements. Mothers stockpiled canned food and bottled water as if preparing for a siege. Children helped organize supplies, learning how to use Geiger counters and emergency radios. Magazines from the era show a surreal picture of normalcy. Articles with titles like "How to Build Your Own Fallout Shelter This Weekend" appeared alongside recipes and home decorating tips. Photos showed smiling families posing in their newly built shelters, as if showing off a new living room instead of a potential tomb. Of course, not everyone could afford a private shelter. The average cost was several $1,000s, an enormous sum in the 1960s. This created social tensions. What if your neighbor had a shelter and you didn't? Would they let you in? These moral questions haunted communities. Some shelter owners installed guns, prepared to defend their survival space from desperate neighbors. Others made community pacts to share resources. The uncomfortable truth was that even with all these shelters, millions of people in dense urban areas probably wouldn't survive a direct nuclear attack. The shelters were designed to protect against fallout, not against the heat and blast of a nuclear detonation. If you lived near ground zero, no basement would save you. But the shelters offered something beyond physical protection. They offered a sense of control. In a world where the nuclear button could be pressed at any moment without warning, having a plan, having a designated place, having supplies stored, gave people an illusion of preparedness. For a family living under nuclear threat, that small comfort was worth more than gold. Letters from the era reveal this strange mix of pragmatic fear and desperate hope. A father might write about installing a steel door on his basement shelter, then casually mention he hopes never to use it. A mother might inventory her survival crackers while planning her family summer vacation. Life went on, but always with that terrifying shadow lurking just beneath the surface. And perhaps strangest of all, the shelters became part of popular culture. They appeared in movies, TV shows, and novels. They became symbols of the era, as iconic as tail-fin cars or black-and-white televisions. They represented both American ingenuity and the existential terror of the atomic age. For a child growing up in the 1960s, fallout shelters were simply part of life. You didn't question why your school had yellow signs in the basement or why you practiced ducking under your desk. You just did it. Because in the Cold War, even childhood came with the shadow of apocalypse. Act 5, Global Spread and Full Reach. The American Fallout Shelter Program didn't stay within American borders. It followed the reach of American influence during the Cold War, spreading through alliances, military bases, and aid programs. Wherever America had a presence, the philosophy of civil defense followed. In Western Europe, especially in West Germany, the United Kingdom, and France, governments developed their own shelter programs, often inspired and supported by American experts. U.S. military bases overseas built extensive bunker systems, not just for military personnel, but also for civilian employees and their families. In Germany, where the Soviet threat was most immediate, entire cities developed evacuation plans and community shelter systems. The United Kingdom adopted a different but complementary approach. While Americans focused on community and private shelters, the British built a network of deep government bunkers and strengthened public basements in major cities. The exchange of information between the two nations helped refine civil defense strategies on both sides of the Atlantic. In the Pacific, American bases in Japan, South Korea, the Philippines, and Guam all had extensive shelter systems. For local civilians living near American military installations, these shelters represented both potential protection and constant reminder of geopolitical tension. Even neutral countries took note. Switzerland, famously neutral, developed the most comprehensive fallout shelter program in the world, eventually requiring that every new residential building constructed after 1978 contain a nuclear shelter capable of withstanding a 12 megaton blast at a distance of 700 meters. By the 1980s, Switzerland had enough shelter capacity to house its entire population, an achievement no other Western country matched. The global footprint was staggering. By the mid-1960s, the American model of civil defense, community shelters, standardized signage, supply stockpiling, and public education had influenced programs in dozens of countries. It became part of Cold War infrastructure, as ubiquitous as military bases or embassies. But perhaps the most surprising deployment was how much the program revealed about American priorities. While the Soviet Union invested massively in public defense infrastructure, building enormous underground bunkers and deep metro systems designed to function as shelters, the United States bet on a decentralized model based on citizens. It was democratic in concept. Each person, each family, each community responsible for their own survival with government support. This philosophical difference said a lot. The Soviet model was authoritarian and centralized. The state protects the elite and expects the rest to follow orders. The American model was individualistic and improvised. The state provides guidance and resources, but each citizen makes their own decisions. Neither was perfect, but they reflected the core values of their respective societies. In the end, the global reach of America's fallout shelter program demonstrated something crucial. The Cold War wasn't just about nuclear weapons. It was about preparation, psychology, and the willingness to make millions of people believe that survival was possible. The shelters became symbols of that belief, physical markers of hope amid existential terror. By 1965, it didn't matter if you were in Manhattan, West Berlin, or Seoul. You'd see the same black and yellow signs, the same civil defense pamphlets, the same survival strategies. They were proof that America hadn't just exported culture and democracy. It had exported an entire philosophy of how to live under the threat of nuclear annihilation. Act 6. The Decline and Second Life. When Cold War tensions began to gradually cool in the late 1960s and early 1970s, most people expected the fallout shelter program to simply fade away. After all, these shelters were built for a crisis that, fortunately, never reached its apocalyptic conclusion. But that's not what happened. Instead, they began a second life, one that no one had really anticipated. First, there was the practical problem. What to do with all those shelters? With tens of thousands of designated buildings across the country, the government suddenly had massive infrastructure that was no longer a priority. Many community shelters were simply abandoned. Emergency supplies stored in basements were forgotten, left to rust and deteriorate for decades. But some buildings held onto their designations long after the Cold War ended. Even today, almost 60 years later, you can walk through cities like New York, Boston, or San Francisco and find original fallout shelter signs still hanging on old buildings. They're rusty, faded, often ignored by pedestrians, but they're still there, silent witnesses to an era of existential fear. For some buildings, the shelter spaces found new purposes. Basements that once stored survival crackers and bottled water were converted to storage, boiler rooms, or office spaces. Schools that had conducted nuclear shelter drills in the 1960s eventually phased them out of their routines, and the basements went back to being just basements. Private shelters had varied fates. Some homeowners filled them in and forgot about them, letting them become buried time capsules of Cold War paranoia. Others repurposed them as wine cellars, storage rooms, or even man caves. A few kept them operational, updating supplies periodically, never quite convinced that the nuclear threat had disappeared. And they were right in a sense. Although the immediate fear of mutual nuclear annihilation subsided after the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991, the threat never completely vanished. Nuclear proliferation continued. New nations developed atomic weapons. Nuclear terrorism became a concern. Every few decades, during moments of renewed international tension, there were small resurgences of interest in fallout shelters. The strangest part, some shelters refused to die. In the 21st century, architects, survivalists, and DIY enthusiasts rediscovered the design principles of Cold War shelters for eco-housing and affordable shelters. The same concepts that worked in 1962, simplicity, durability, and cost efficiency, still make sense today. Some companies even manufacture modernized shelter-style structures for farms, workshops, and yes, emergency preparedness. Culturally, fallout shelters gained a kind of iconic status. They became symbols of the Cold War itself, visual shorthand for an era of fear, preparation, and the strange normalcy of living under threat of apocalypse. Artists, filmmakers, and writers constantly reference them. Museums preserve them. Historians study them. And perhaps the most enduring legacy is educational. The Fallout Shelter program taught valuable lessons about civil defense, emergency management, and community resilience. Many principles developed in the 1960s, building assessments, emergency supply stockpiling, public communication systems, still inform disaster preparedness today. In some towns, people still gather in community centers that were once surplus fallout shelters. Their concrete walls and reinforced structures now hosting dances, meetings, and Sunday services. The spaces designed for humanity's darkest hour have been reclaimed for everyday life. The story doesn't end there. After September 11, 2001, and natural disasters like Hurricane Katrina, there was renewed interest in civil defense and emergency shelters. The principles learned from the Cold War era, shelter identification, supply distribution, public communication, became relevant again, adapted for new threats. And maybe that's the most striking legacy of all. These shelters were supposed to be temporary, but like the generation that built them, they endured. They became markers of a generation's struggle with existential fear, still standing as reminders of both human fragility and determination to survive. So next time you see one of those black and yellow signs still hanging on an old building, or you walk past a basement entrance marked with faded paint, remember that humble shelter represented America's attempt to protect its citizens from the unthinkable. It helped a nation live through decades of nuclear terror, gave families hope when hope seemed irrational, and went on to shape how we think about disaster preparedness in ways no one could have imagined. In its own quiet way, the fallout shelter is as much a symbol of the Cold War as the Berlin Wall, the space race, or the nuclear arsenal itself. Proof that sometimes the most powerful weapons aren't the ones designed to destroy, but the ones designed to protect and preserve. And proof that even in humanity's darkest moments, we never stop planning for survival.